So we've heard about sanctions before on North Korea. Why are these different? Let's begin there.
Well, first of all, there's this myth that there was nothing else to sanction in North Korea, and Nikki Haley and President Trump and Rex Tillerson, our Secretary of State, proved that wrong. This is a major foreign policy accomplishment for the Trump administration because these are massive, sweeping sanctions, and that we got everybody on board at the UN Security Council is a big deal. So this is going to really squeeze the North Korean regime about as much up to a third of their export revenues that they make. Now, the key now, though, is to see if China is actually going to enforce these sanctions and if China isn't going to look for other opportunities to make up for the revenue loss for the North Koreans.
We'll talk a little bit more about China, but let's take a look specifically at the sanctions, which have been approved, as we mentioned, 15-0 unanimously across the board. Supposedly will ban coal and other exports worth over $1 billion. You can see the other exports there in addition to coal. But you were referencing China, and I know specifically in terms of the sanctions that have been placed before on North Korea, coal specifically was one that China, disregarded.
Well, there was some indication that there may have been a little bit of a dip with Chinese imports, but then what the Chinese did was, well, first of all, there's a humanitarian loophole that said that if some of the Chinese exports, the revenues that was made, went to the North Korean civilians, that would be acceptable. But that was a farce. The North Koreans don't care about their civilians, they don't care about their people, and so all of that money, all of that revenue actually went to the military and to the missile program. So there are no more loopholes like that. But again, the Chinese, even when things like coal were sanctioned, the Chinese looked for other opportunities to increase, for instance, seafood and minerals and other goods like that. But those are covered in the sanctions that were just passed. And so again, this is really going to squeeze the regime as long as they're enforced.
The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, more commonly known as North Korea, has been long shrouded in mystery and secrecy. Despite its isolated status, the country's economy has been a topic of interest for many, particularly in recent years as sanctions and other economic pressures have taken their toll.
US has imposed fresh sanctions on North Korean officials involved in development and testing of ICBM.
In this video, we will take a closer look at the North Korean economy, examining its history, current state, and prospects for the future. Let's travel back in time to 1948. At that time, the world was emerging from the devastation of World War II. Korea, a country torn by conflicting ideologies, was divided between the Soviet-backed North and the US-backed South. Until the present day, the North remains under the grip of communist rule, with its intriguing history dominated by the leadership of its charismatic and controversial great leader, Kim Il-sung, whose influence dominated the country's political affairs for nearly half a century, leaving an indelible mark on the country's past, present, and future. The history of North Korea is dominated by the Kim dynasty, which has ruled the country in an iron grip for decades. Kim Il-sung, the country's first leader, founded the precursor of the Communist Party of Korea and initiated the Korean War. He built a cult of personality around himself and his family, promoting the ideology of self-reliance or juche. After his death, his son Kim Jong-il continued his policies, facing severe economic hardships and food shortages while pursuing nuclear weapons development. Kim Jong-un succeeded his father and continued the pursuit of nuclear ambitions and military provocations.
Our top story, North Korea claims to have tested a new nuclear-capable underwater attack drone. The state media said that this drone is capable of generating a radioactive tsunami,
while also showing some sign of economic liberalization and diplomatic engagement. Despite these changes, North Korea remains one of the most repressive societies in the world, with systematic human rights violations and no tolerance for dissent. Behind the veil of its enigmatic leadership and nuclear ambitions, North Korea hides one of the world's most secretive and repressive societies. Here, human rights violations are the norm, and dissent is simply not tolerated. The extent of this suppression is staggering, and the world has been watching with increasing concern as North Korea continues to trample on the basic rights of its citizens. North Korea has long been one of the world's most prominent examples of a communist state. The country's official ideology, known as juche or chuche, emphasizes self-reliance, national independence, and the importance of the state over the individual. Under Kim Il-sung's rule, North Korea was characterized by a centralized, state-run economy, strict control over the media, and freedom of expression. and a pervasive cult of personality that elevated the leader to near godlike status. Political opposition was not tolerated, and any perceived threats to the state were met with swift and brutal repression. Despite the collapse of communism in many parts of the world, North Korea has continued to embrace this ideology and has remained largely isolated from the rest of the world. Today, the country remains a one-party state, with the Workers' Party of Korea, WPK, as the only legal political party. While some economic reforms have been introduced in recent years, the government maintains a tight grip on all aspects of society, and human rights abuses continue to be reported.
Today, the UN General Assembly voted to hold North Korean leaders accountable for human rights violations.
What are some other negative impacts of communism on North Korea's economy and the prosperity of its people? The impact of communism on North Korea's economy has been nothing short of catastrophic. The country's command economy, where the country controls everything and sets priorities, has resulted in chronic economic problems. Despite the best efforts of the state, the people of North Korea have suffered from shortages of basic necessities, such as food, fuel, and machinery. Low productivity, inefficiency, and mismanagement have also contributed to the country's economic woes. It's clear that communism has failed North Korea and its people, leaving them struggling to meet even their most basic needs. Parents who enroll their children in school are required to supply them with desks, chairs, building supplies, and money for the cost of heating fuel. Some pupils are assigned to work making things for the government or collecting trash. And even though it is against the law, parents can pay teachers to keep their children from working or from attending school. Despite the advancement in technology, the lack of internet access in North Korea has left around 1.5 million mobile phone users stranded in a communication black hole. The network is patchy, and people cannot access the internet, severely limiting their connectivity to the rest of the world. Interestingly, during power outages at night, people use their mobile phones as a source of light, making these devices not just a communication tool, but also an essential survival tool in North Korea. The country's quest for self-reliance and isolationism has led to its exclusion from the global economy, with most countries imposing economic sanctions that have severely limited North Korea's access to foreign trade and investment. Despite this, the country has maintained strong ties with a few key allies like China and Russia, but has been largely unsuccessful in attracting foreign investment due to its special economic zones. The consequences of North Korea's isolationist policies and its persistent pursuit of nuclear weapons continue to be felt both inside and outside its borders. The consequences of communism in North Korea are devastating, with poverty and malnutrition affecting the lives of millions of its citizens. During the 1990s, the country faced a series of natural disasters and the loss of its former allies, leading to widespread famine and starvation. The situation has improved somewhat with international food aid, but chronic malnutrition, stunted growth, and diseases continue to plague the population. It's a stark reminder of how economic mismanagement and centralized control can have disastrous effects on people's lives. The North Korean Communist regime has been the subject of widespread condemnation for its flagrant and systematic human rights abuses. From political repression to censorship and torture, the regime has been accused of a litany of violations, including arbitrary detention, executions, and forced labor. The regime has also imposed strict restrictions on basic freedoms, such as freedom of movement, expression, religion, and association, using a combination of propaganda, informers, and secret police to maintain control. And what about the years of sanctions and the alienation of the country? That's another controversial topic. Did you know that China has been providing a lifeline for the North Korean economy for decades? In fact, more than 90% of all imports to North Korea come from China, including necessities such as refined petroleum, food, electronics equipment, and fertilizers. In exchange, North Korea mainly export coal briquettes to China. But that's not all. Chinese companies also make use of cheap North Korean labor to import clothes or semi-finished products fabricated in North Korea and re-export these to Western countries labeled Made in China. North Korea's economic dependence on China is a double-edged sword. While China has been a vital lifeline for North Korea's economy, in return, North Korea mostly exports coal briquettes to China. However, this economic relationship comes with a heavy price tag for China. North Korea's weak economic structure and inability to exploit its natural resources on a large scale mean that it cannot offer much in return. What are some of the consequences of years of sanctions and the alienation of the country? Imagine being cut off from the world and having limited access to resources, technology, and markets. This is the reality for North Korea, a country that has been isolated and sanctioned for years. The consequences have been severe, including economic hardship and isolation. The country has struggled to grow and develop its economy and has become increasingly dependent on China for survival. Former allies and trading partners have been lost, leaving North Korea with limited options for trade and investment. The situation has created a challenging environment for the people of North Korea, who continue to face the consequences of this isolation. Despite facing international sanctions for its nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles program, North Korea has not been deterred from pursuing its goals. In fact, some experts suggest that the sanctions may have even incentivized the country to accelerate its efforts, as it views these programs as essential for its security and survival. Also, the sanctions have forced North Korea to seek alternative sources of income, such as cyber attacks, money laundering, and illicit trade, which further exacerbates the issue. The impact of sanctions on North Korea extends far beyond its economy and security. Sanctions have worsened the already dire humanitarian situation in the country, where millions of people face hunger, malnutrition, and inadequate access to essential healthcare and services. These sanctions have also limited the ability of humanitarian organizations to provide aid and assistance to the most vulnerable groups in society, including children, women, the elderly, and those with disabilities. In addition to the economic and political consequences of sanctions, their humanitarian impact cannot be ignored. The North Korean regime has a pattern of using international sanctions imposed on the country as a justification for its human rights violations. The government claims that these sanctions are a form of external aggression, which helps to rally the population behind a nationalist and militaristic agenda. This approach served to deflect criticism of the regime's failures and reinforces the government's control over its citizens, who are made to feel constantly under threat from external forces. But is regime change the only way forward for North Korea? While regime change may seem like the easiest solution to end communism in North Korea, it is also the riskiest option with significantly negative implications, including the possibility of war, chaos, and a humanitarian crisis. On top of that, North Korea's leadership is incredibly stubborn, and any external pressure may backfire. A more realistic and peaceful way to end communism in North Korea might be to encourage gradual reforms and opening up within the country. This could be done by engaging North Korea diplomatically, economically, and culturally, and offering incentives and guarantees for its security and development. Such a strategy could help to reduce tensions and mistrust between North Korea and the rest of the world and create more opportunities for dialogue and cooperation. It could also expose North Koreans to alternative ideas and values, and inspire them to demand more freedom and rights from their government. However, this approach also faces many challenges and obstacles. North Korea might not be willing to accept such a policy, as it might see it as a threat to its sovereignty and ideology. Also, the international community may not be able to agree on a common policy towards North Korea, as different countries have different interests and perspectives on the issue. Another challenge is that North Korean people might not be able to access or benefit from such a policy, as the regime might try to block or control any information or resources that come from the outside. As you can see, ending communism in North Korea is not a simple or straightforward task. Let's know what you think in the comment section. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay up to date on the latest news about what's happening in the world today. Thanks for watching.